this point. Okay, and many of you received the email earlier in the week when Steve's presentation was available. But again, these are being archived on the church website, firstpaloalto.com /great decisions -2022 recordings. If any of you did not get that message from the alias earlier in the week, just go ahead and you can send me a private email and I'll make sure that you do get that. And I think that's it for now. So I will hand the presentation over to Tom at this point.
Thank you, Lou. That just to confirm, everybody can hear me. Good. I see the heads going up and down. That I will add my apologies for the technical problems on the first talk on Biden's foreign policy. My hope is that most of the people who are on this Zoom did understand enough of that that I'm not going to repeat. I'm going to build upon it. That one of the aspects of all of these great decision topics is that there's always enough information, enough material, enough issues to have multiple sessions on the same topic. And I hope you think this second one on Biden's foreign policy meets that criterion. That in order to bring up to speed people that didn't hear their first talk and remind others, I want to repeat and underscore 3 key points from that previous talk that I intend to build upon this evening. The first is my judgment that Biden, and when I say Biden, I mean the Biden administration, not simply the president himself. Biden is giving priority to problems and challenges, not to places, not to particular countries or regions of the world. And that is an important distinction, and I hope will become clear from the examples I'll use to illustrate the policy this evening. That it wasn't a foregone conclusion that he would do that. There was certainly, during the primary campaigns and within the Democratic Party, as well as the Republican Party, substantial calls to reorient American foreign policy to accord with what was called the return of great power politics, to focus on the major rivals or competitors, China and Russia, usually in that order. And clearly, to me, Biden made the decision to reject those importunings in order to give primacy to a rather long list of specific problems. Given what's happening now in Ukraine, it's a reasonably safe prediction that there are going to be a lot more pressures to redo his foreign policy approach to give primacy to Russia. It's amazing how quickly Russia has moved ahead of China as a concern and a focus of the pundits who fill op-eds and are talking heads on television. The second point I made in that first talk is that Biden's foreign policy derives from his focus on primarily domestic problems, but supplemented by international or transnational problems or challenges, first and foremost being climate change, but also terrorism, immigration, international health, and the like. But a key role of foreign policy with the approach of this administration is to create the international context for pursuing solutions to these domestic and transnational problems. Countries are important or less important based on what they can do to help achieve the long list of problem-centered objectives, and whether or not or in what way they impede achievement of those transnational and national objectives. Foreign policy with this framework is intended to maintain peace and foster stability. Otherwise, everyone's attention is diverted of necessity into dealing with the threats to peace and stability, and Ukraine is example number one. But it also requires of the foreign policy an effort to forge coalitions that are able to contribute to the solution of particular critical problems. These are problem-based coalitions, not friends, allies, partners across the board for everything automatically. These are problem-solving groupings, and the expectation of the administration and the way it is carried out the policy is that it will be easiest and most efficacious to build these coalitions around our natural allies, our longstanding allies, traditional partners, countries that share many of the same values and the same priorities with respect to the problems that Biden needs to and wishes to tackle. So this leads to policy of rebuilding and revitalizing alliances. But as we're seeing in Ukraine, there is both a visible and a still below the surface of transformation of NATO from being a defensive military alliance intended to protect the territory, the societies, the economies of the member states into an alliance of shared values. So what is the rationale for NATO playing the role that it is playing vis-a-vis Ukraine? It's not an ally, and NATO hasn't been attacked. Why are we there? And I think the answer, and I'll talk about this more later, is the group of like-minded countries with shared concerns about treatment of civilians, about the importance of democracy, about honoring commitments and the like, is operating under the name of NATO, but not in the way that NATO was organized to operate. And finally, going back to the campaign, Biden has given considerable priority to strengthening democracy at home and supporting democracies internationally. That's very different than spreading democracies, which was an objective of the George W. Bush administration. I'll have a little more to say on this. The third point I made 2 weeks ago is that the foreign policy of Biden's administration will challenge or compete with other countries when that's necessary. But the primary focus is on focusing on cooperation with any and all who can help or must be a part of a solution. No permanent across the board adversaries, no permanent across the board partners and allies. That countries that are like-minded on things that the United States values can be active and engaged partners. Countries that on particular issues, gender discrimination, to pick just one, it disqualifies traditional partners of the United States as in the Middle East. As a part of this work with who you can or who you need to, the administration began from the earliest days to work with Russia to enhance strategic stability, nuclear stability. I don't think that would have been where he chose to start, but it's an illustration of sometimes timelines and calendars drive events. And the New START treaty negotiated between Putin and Obama expired less than 2 weeks after the Biden administration took office. And that's the only remaining arms control agreement with verification procedures in it. Both sides wanted that extended, and that was done. And the context was that there was a pledge to work on other security issues of concern to both sides. Some of the ones that Putin has put in his list of demands include the issues on which the United States had already agreed to negotiate. Similarly, early on, working with China on climate change, getting another bilateral agreement in advance of the conference in the United Kingdom on it. But again, no permanent, no absolute enemies, adversaries, presumed opponents. Try to work with others until that proves impossible. So that was last time. What I want to do this evening is to illustrate how that approach is being implemented. Depending on how windy I am, I will either have a few or many examples to illustrate. But let me begin with a truism of international affairs. And this is probably a point at which I ought to explain to people who don't know me that I spent the mid part of my career, but that mid part was 23 years in senior positions in Washington, most of them in the State Department. So my comments tonight are informed by 2 decades of high-level experience in both Democrat and Republican administrations. I had presidential appointments from Bill Clinton and from George W. Bush. Not a partisan guy. I'm an equal opportunity critic. But let me turn first to George H.W. Bush, Bush 41. He very much wanted to forge what he called a new world order in the aftermath of the Cold War that would be built on the remains of the superpower rivalry, the alliances and the groupings led by Moscow and led by Washington. Use building blocks that already existed, only with a presumption that we could now work together and not always in opposition to one another. But this plan was rather quickly disrupted by Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, that the first Gulf War. Another early development that derailed was the Tiananmen incident in China, which greatly changed relations, not just with China, but with other parts of Asia. Clinton entered office with a different vision and approach. His, I would summarize as reinvigorating the United Nations so that it could achieve the goals envisioned by its founders of international cooperation to solve multinational, transnational problems. A capacity that was thwarted throughout the Cold War, because if we wanted to do it, the Soviet Union would oppose it. If the Soviet Union wanted to oppose it, wanted to do something, we would oppose it. That the idea was a noble one. But the disintegration of Yugoslavia and the onset of the Balkan Wars and genocide in the Balkans and in Africa became a monumental distraction. Distraction because it was of obvious importance. George W. Bush, Bush 43, wanted to focus on China and on domestic developments. But 9/11 and then the Afghanistan and Iraq wars totally scotched the initial intent for foreign policy. It's hard to know what Mr. Trump envisioned by way of a foreign policy vision. Make America great again is not a blueprint to do anything. And America as number one doesn't provide very many opportunities or hints about cooperation, about where effort would be directed. Stuff happens, though, even when there are no plans or priorities. So we basically had 4 years of chaotic and episodic and uncoordinated responses to international developments. So for Biden, putting the pieces back together again, restoring credibility within our alliances, restoring credibility and leadership and capacity to interact with countries that were not formal allies, making American policy more coherent, more predictable, and more acceptable to a wide range of countries. That, I believe, fixing that was a primary shaper of the administration's foreign policy and remains a primary constraint as well as influence on a foreign policy. But Putin's invasion of Ukraine is the stuff happens development that has changed the conditions under which Biden is forced to operate, may change priorities, may change targets of foreign policy. I say may because so far the administration seems to be following what I interpret to be its original game plan and approach. And I'll begin by using Biden's handling of the Ukraine crisis to illustrate the application of the approach I summarized at the beginning of this talk and at more length last time I spoke. Key elements of that agenda are pursuing pandemic relief, restoring the US economy, using Build Back Better as a way not just of rebuilding infrastructure, but of addressing social justice issues, voter suppression efforts, the partisan divide that has paralyzed decision-making in Washington and led to a host of retrograde legislation or proposed legislation in states, in many of the states of the country. That in order to focus on these issues, individually, they're very ambitious and very difficult and very demanding of resources and political capital and time and attention. Together, it'd be almost overwhelming if they weren't reasonably well integrated in the policies for pursuing them. So that pursuing policies in one area assist in the pursuit of solutions to problems, challenges in a number of other issue arenas. So in the foreign policy realm and using foreign policy to advance this agenda, job number one, and I think task number one undertaken by the administration, was to reassure allies and do general cleanup after the wreckage of Hurricane Trump. That in order to collaborate on a solution of problems, it was necessary to reassure and reforge relationships, to regain acceptance as a worthy leader, as a responsible partner. And I think much of his first year was devoted to doing that. The most visible place in which he did it, and arguably the most important arena, was Europe. Restoring confidence in NATO, restoring confidence in the US nuclear umbrella, reassuring or reaffirming that the logic that brought the United States into Europe after World War II and the European goal of keeping the United States in Europe because it was desirable to have us there had to be restored. But while doing that, I think it's been a conscious as well as pretty successful effort of the administration to not just restore NATO, but to transform NATO into a values-based alliance. To move beyond the idea of NATO as a legacy organization left over from the Cold War that was forged to deter a country that no longer exists, the Soviet Union, and to move beyond fights about who paid how much, and equally important fights over whether or not the NATO alliance should engage in any activities outside of the territory of the member states. Should NATO go to Afghanistan as NATO? That one was answered by Article 5 of the alliance. The United States was attacked, so NATO members were obligated to come to US defense, and that defense was executed initially in Afghanistan. But should NATO have a role in stability in the Middle East, in stability in Africa, or any other part of the world? That this transformation of NATO must have been taking place below the surface. Otherwise, we all wouldn't have been so surprised, including people like me that have spent decades involved in international affairs. But the speed and the unanimity of the North Atlantic response, North America plus Europe, response to the invasion of Ukraine. I think anybody involved in international affairs or European affairs, strategic affairs, would have said there's zero to no chance of getting unanimity within NATO for the providing of arms and other kinds of support to Ukraine. Would have said there's no chance whatsoever that the Germans would drop their decades-long prohibition on sending weapons to a conflict zone. No chance whatsoever that the neutral states, Sweden, Finland, Switzerland, would align with the NATO states in imposing sanctions. And it has to do with the concept of what this grouping is. It doesn't want to simply be a group that stops bad things from happening. It's now more clearly a group that thinks it's important to work together to accomplish good things, where good things here are solving the effects of climate change, preventing further spread of nuclear weapons, preparing for the next pandemic outbreak that we're going to have to deal with, and so forth. So one purpose or objective in this transformation of this alliance, the NATO alliance, picked up on the Biden objective of strengthening and defending democracy. And if one listens to the commentary, not just the talking heads, but the heads of government who are talking about engagement, involvement, the issues in Ukraine, it's a lot about defending democracy. That Ukraine is deserving of help because it is a democracy. Now, in my own view, characterizing the Ukraine as a smoothly functioning democracy is a bit of an exaggeration. It's clearly a new democracy, and it's clearly under siege. But the idea that countries would band together for democracy and that be a mission of NATO is new. And it didn't come out of nowhere. It came out in part of the Biden administration's efforts to bring it to the fore. And finally, on the transformation of NATO and NATO in responding to Ukraine, I think the administration has been very careful not to get out in front of our partners by announcing what sanctions are. For example, Nord Stream 2, the pipeline from Russia to Germany, that from even before he took office, there was strong pressure within Congress, mostly from Republicans, but also from Democrats, that the United States should forbid completion of the Nord Stream pipeline. I think the bases for doing that are frankly questionable, but have to do with American technology going into the construction and operation of the pipeline. But Biden didn't do that. He made clear this is a German decision. Germany paid for this pipeline. It would terminate in Germany. That he didn't think it was a good idea, but it wasn't America's role to stop it. This is a variant of what inelegantly got named during the Obama administration of leading from behind. The United States didn't have to be out in the front all the time, because one consequence of being in front all the time was we looked like a bully. It looked like we were dictating the policies and the actions of partners that clearly Biden is more interested in not just depicting, but having them feel that they are partners, if not quite equal partners, but genuine partners in the pursuit of collective undertakings. I think his administration has also made clear that the United States will not automatically be the default setting for instability, dealing with instability in the region around the NATO territory. The decades-long presumption that if there was problems in the Middle East, if there was problems in the former Soviet space, the Americans would rush to the fore. And I think Biden, reflecting the views of the American public that after 20 years of continuous warfare has had enough and wants a damn good reason before going into combat again, that we're not going alone. If NATO goes as a group, we'll be a part of it. And that is a pretty fundamental change. Staying in step with the Europeans. Not announcing some of the sanctions until all of the European members of NATO had signed on. And just by the way, the rules of NATO, all it takes is one. Any one state can veto consensus. And that didn't happen, given Poland and Hungary's close relationship with Russia, given Germany's heavy economic dependence on Russia. But the administration worked this in a way that let the Europeans be out front most of the time. One of the ways I think he brought this about, the administration brought this about, was the public sharing of intelligence information about what the Russian army was doing, how it was moving forces, what Putin planned to do with this. That there was a mini debate in the United States, in Washington, about how smart is it to tell what our intelligence capabilities are by publicizing this. I think it was very smart. I think those who release the information are clever enough, understand the process well enough. And again, just one of my jobs, I was the deputy director of national intelligence, so I've got a pretty good idea what we're talking about here, that they didn't give away the store. But this, I think, added to pressure on European leaders from their own publics, that it made it harder for European leaders to practice old-style realpolitik and decide on a low profile, this isn't our problem, let's stay out of it, leading to inaction. Their publics demanded a response to the situation that they knew about, primarily from the US release of intelligence information. The careful avoidance of hot button or divisive initiatives, like expanding NATO. President Zelensky, who clearly is worthy of a great deal of respect and admiration, but his calls repeated, I guess it's now 2 days ago and maybe since, for immediate admission to NATO by Ukraine. The administration isn't biting on this, in part because they're certainly not ready. But that changes it into a conflict that would require US involvement. And as I said earlier, I don't think the American public is ready for another war. I don't think the European publics are ready for a war that could spread into their territory a lot more easily than it would spread to the United States. And because of acute awareness at the top of the political systems here, that Russian nuclear policy has reversed what was the Soviet Union policy on use of nuclear weapons. That the policy now is nuclear weapons can be used if Russia is suffering defeat with conventional arms. It's the same posture that the United States maintained for decades in NATO, where conventional forces were much weaker. So our deterrent from conventional war was to threaten nuclear war. That's what Putin, not just the couple of days ago when he raised the alert level of nuclear weapons, but his references to them, it's in the context of publicly declared changes in nuclear policy. And the Biden administration has very carefully stayed away from triggering that hot button nest of issues. The early and repeated affirmation that the US would not send troops into Ukraine. Again, that's playing to American public. It's changing the expectations of Europeans that, in the end, the Americans will go in. They think they got better equipment. They think they got better intelligence. They have no common sense. For them, it's an away game. They'll go in. And he was very careful, I think, to disabuse them of that idea. And it also does reduce the danger of escalation to nuclear conflict. One of the too often overlooked aspects of the application of this policy is the speed with which the administration accepted some of the demands on Putin's list, rejected the totality of it because it has completely unreasonable demands with respect to Ukraine's sovereignty, the government of Ukraine, and NATO decision-making, what it could do in the future. But Biden quickly accepted demands for negotiations on new types of weapons that are still in the developmental stage to head off a dangerous and expensive arms race around new systems. The hypersonic delivery vehicles, these maneuverable, many times the speed of sound missiles that can evade detection, evade anti-missile defenses. Most extreme, they can go around the South Pole. We have no early warning stuff to protect us from stuff going around the South Pole. We, like the Russians, have it all up for the North Pole. Another is to ban classes of missiles that once were covered by a treaty. The treaty was abrogated by the United States. And now there are no limits on missiles, intermediate range missiles, that if deployed now in NATO territory, can reach Moscow in 10 minutes. That's not much decision time. If you think they might be coming, you better launch pretty quickly. So it makes the relationship much, much more dangerous. And the US is quite willing to, again, ban this class of missiles. Cooperate where it's possible and in mutual interest to do so. So some of the decisions that the Europeans have been enabled to make, allowed to make, urged to make quietly. German decision to not complete Nord Stream 2, his gas pipeline. The German decision to allow the transfer of weapons made by Germany, sold to Estonia, that Estonia wishes to give to Ukraine. Hungary and Poland, as I mentioned, have not blocked NATO or EU actions. They could do so. Switzerland, the quintessential neutral country, has joined the imposition of sanctions and authorized military assistance to Ukraine. Increased military spending. For decades, the United States has pressed its NATO allies to spend more on defense. Donald Trump made this a great cause and threatened to withdraw from NATO, break up NATO over this issue. His countries were not reaching a target that is still a couple of years out of 2% of GDP for defense spending. Germany has announced that it will get to 2% this year. It's effectively doubling its defense budget this year. Poland has also allocated a great deal more money to defense. And Europeans clearly have put democracy above access to Russian energy. The roughly 30% dependence on Russian oil and gas in a cold winter, needed for heating, needed for industrial purposes. But the willingness to impose sanctions, and not just on Nord Stream, but that in essence invite Putin to turn off the tap, and are willing to accommodate the cost and the pain of that. Another illustration of the policy that I think, I'm happy it doesn't get more attention, because attention to this one is not helpful. And that's pursuing an alternative source of energy supply to Europe. And much attention has been placed on liquefied natural gas from the United States, and that makes it look like we want to cut the Europeans off so we can sell more to them. I don't think that's the motivation at all. But the alternative source of supply, I probably should have put up a map, but if you've got a mental picture of that side of the earth, energy routes from Central Asia, as well as from Russia, can go one of two routes. It can go through Russia to Europe, or it can go through Iran to Europe. We, for quite a few years, have objected and in essence have blocked transmission of oil and gas from the Persian Gulf, from Central Asia, through Iran to Turkey and into Europe that way. The negotiations with Iran to achieve lifting of sanctions imposed by the Trump administration and Iran's return to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the agreement that was reached in 2015 that severely limits Iran's nuclear program, that the indications are that the United States and Tehran are very close to an agreement that would lift the sanctions, that would open the way for moving energy through Iran into Turkey. And that's a permanent loss of market to Russia. I'm going to quickly take up China. It relates to Ukraine, but illustrates some different dimensions of the Biden foreign policy. As I said, the administration has rejected calls to make China the centerpiece of foreign policy. That number one priority should be containing, constraining, challenging China in much the same way that the Soviet Union was the centerpiece of American foreign policy for decades of the Cold War. And everything else was sort of dependent on what we thought we had to do would deal with the Soviet threat. The Biden administration has rejected the calls to make China that kind of replacement for the Soviet Union. But he has used China in much the same way that administrations going back to Eisenhower used the Soviet Union to justify the need for action on a wide range of domestic and progressive policies. I mentioned some of these in the earlier talk, justifying preschool education for everyone to meet the challenge of China, increasing the amount of money that the federal government puts into basic and applied research to meet the China challenge, solving some of our social justice problems, the inequities, so that we look like a country that honors our own values better than we do. We need to do that so that China doesn't win the competition for hearts and minds. Now, most of these justifications are nonsense in my estimation. But if it helps to get congressional approval of things we ought to be doing anyway, and infrastructure kind of stands out, even though that one has been funded, the traditional definition of infrastructure, that was linked to a China threat. Fixing better roads is not going to do anything to impede China. We need to do it anyway. You got to fix the roads because they're bad. With respect to China, Biden has not changed all but a few of Trump's wrong-headed policies. If I think they're wrong-headed, why do I call attention to Biden not changing them? I think the reason is he doesn't want to fight about China policy. Leaving the policies in place, tariffs being the marquee example, when businesses have figured out a way around them, that the pain imposed by those tariffs has largely been felt, and there are workarounds for it. But to announce we're going to change our China policy, even if the way you wanted to change it to made sense in my judgment, that's going to take a lot of time and political capital and political bandwidth, ability to work on issues that's going to come from someplace. And he doesn't want to take it away from the higher priority items on the agenda. So this was not hurting us very much. The pain in terms of US-China relations and deterioration, it's already been felt. It's going to take a long time to rebuild that relationship. But that one can sit as far as he's concerned. The way in which he adopted a low-key approach to the Olympics, announcing he wasn't going. And high-level administration people were not going to attend the opening of the Olympics. But he didn't restrict or suggest that athletes shouldn't go, or if ordinary Americans wanted to go and put up with the very, very onerous quarantine restrictions. He wasn't blocking that, made his point with respect to Xinjiang and human rights. I suspect probably also did it in anticipation of things developing in Russia-Ukraine relations that were going to make it imprudent to be out of town, to be halfway around the world. But that wasn't given as a public rationale for not going. Letting NBC basically decide on coverage. And the way my tuning in episodically, they covered it as a sporting event, not as an opportunity to talk about China, not to show off China, not to interview Chinese on their economy, that it could have been any place because the focus was on the athletes. Another way in which I think the administration has exhibited the work together when you can, seek help where you might get it, was what we now know is the use of several channels at various levels of government to share information on Russian actions and planning with the Chinese. Now, most of this, I suspect, is the same as the intelligence information that was released publicly, but I probably took it to the Chinese earlier, in private. That surely we have a shared interest in preserving the sovereignty, territorial integrity of Ukraine. You may know this already from your own capabilities, but we're sharing it with you so that you will know. I doubt that that was accompanied by any effort to persuade China to act in a particular way. We now know, at least from media accounts, that some of this information was shared by the Chinese with the Russians. That to me is not a big deal. The Russians already knew what they were doing. They didn't have to learn from us telling the Chinese on it. But it laid down a baseline of information provided by the United States that could be used to assess Putin, Russian government's public statements and private statements to China. So there's now a pretty clear evidentiary record of Putin lying to the Chinese. That may not bother the Chinese very much, but I think it probably does. So, and the way that this was done, doing it privately, not a public effort to put pressure on China or demands that it do something, or chastising Xi Jinping for the very long joint statement that he issued with Putin at the opening, or after the opening day of the Olympics, but then publicizing it after the fact, putting the onus on Xi Jinping and some other senior leaders to explain to others in the top leadership. And because this stuff bangs around on social media, explain to their own people why they were gullible enough to be lied to by Putin. And that's not just a matter of personalities in this, because the invasion of Ukraine by Russia violates one of the most sacrosanct principles of Chinese foreign policy, which is respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity and non-interference in the internal affairs of another country. So on the one hand, China and Russia both have been depicting for a couple of years their new relationship as closer than it's ever been. That Xi declared his support for Putin is without limit in February. The reason for attempting to depict the relationship that way is they think it gives them leverage with the United States, with the West more generally. A recreation of a kind of strategic triangle that was said to exist after Nixon went to China and changed the calculus in Moscow about what Washington and Beijing might do together. This time, it's an effort to get more leverage on the United States, on Europe primarily. So hanging on to the fig leaf that this is an important relationship is an objective of China's foreign policy. But it puts them out of step with every one of their major trading partners in East Asia, in North America, and in Europe. And to make it better or worse, depending, better if you're an American, worse if you're Chinese, it illustrates, dramatizes how hollow the special relationship that China has proclaimed itself having with Ukraine. For 11 years, they have been strategic partners, which is a step up from partnership and a step down from comprehensive strategic partnership, which is a step down from alliance. And I confess, I haven't got a clue what any of these things actually mean. But what it's demonstrated to me is now when Ukraine is under assault, the Chinese have decided to take a pass. They can't even bring themselves to criticize the Russian action. The way in which the Biden administration has played this, depicted it, I think is near brilliant. We don't look to the third countries, much of the world that focuses on US, China, and animosity, antipathy. Like we're the ones provoking here. And this is, the Chinese crawled out on this branch all by themselves. And we're not cheering and applauding this in a way that undermines the decisions that will be made by lots and lots of other countries about who actually stands up for stuff that they care about. Giving the Chinese the information about the planning, along with the plenty of warnings, the public warnings about intention to impose harsh sanctions. There's no way China could have been surprised by US, NATO, Japanese, and other sanctions. But I think they were shocked and appalled at the unity of NATO, because their policies have been predicated on exploiting fissures within the EU and within NATO and separate them both from the United States. That these are serious, big time sanctions with the potential to cripple the Russian economy for a very long time. And it's not very much of a leap of thought to say, would these democracies do that if we do something vis-a-vis Taiwan? If we use military force on Taiwan, can we really withstand that kind of sanctions? And they know they're more heavily dependent on Europe and North America than Russia is. So there is a non-explicit message to China, don't even think about going there. And that's a useful message, because there's been so much, to me, inappropriate, unnecessary hand-wringing about the imminent danger of a Chinese attack on Taiwan. But since that's the context, this is you better rethink that if you were thinking about doing this. Again, I want to open up to questions now. I won't do other things, but there are other examples of the policy that I sketched out at the beginning. The summit of Quad leaders, US, Japan, Australia, and India, last September, and the things that they agreed to do. Much of the media commentary is on this as an anti-China containment. But that's not what the summit announced. What they undertook is, it's a very positive agenda. Pilot cooperation in combating pandemic disease and strengthening global health, agreement to collectively provide free 1.2 billion vaccine doses for COVID. Build Back Better, W. Build Back Better World. And that linked to Japan's quality infrastructure initiatives for coordination on regional development. Cooperation for green shipping, green hydrogen partnerships. This is a way of going after climate change problems by linking together some of the most technologically advanced countries in the world. The Summit for Democracy, which held in December of 2021. The AUKUS Pact, that's Australia, United Kingdom, and United States. A rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific region. And it's not explicitly targeted at anybody. Commitment for public health and building back better in Africa. Just not much has happened yet, but the declaratory policy is there. A Latin America summit of the Americas, will be held in Los Angeles in August. Again, this is build back better for the world. Collaboration, increased funding, increased investment, gets at trade barriers and the like. It's, I think, pretty impressive. So far, I'm also impressed by the willingness and ability to stick with it, even in the face of the enormous disruption and challenges of the invasion of Ukraine. I think, and I'll close here, that what's going on in Ukraine will produce new pressures to revise the national security strategy, to put Russia front and center, to make dealing with Russia and Europe the centerpiece. I don't think that's where we're going to go as a country. It'll remain an important target and object of policy, but sticking with the issue-focused agenda, which, if my analysis is more or less accurate, has got to be judged as it's working. It's not just some vision, it's working. Let me stop there and open up for questions.
Thank you, Tom. Excellent presentation. I'll start off with a question. You mentioned that the sanctions that are currently in place are going to harm the Russian economy for, I think you said, a long time. So what does that mean? How long is it going to be before the quote unquote average Russian begins to see some effect? And is that effect going to have any substantive effect on the government?
Well, it's a terrific question. And the short answer is we don't know. That the manipulation and control of information in Russia is pretty extensive. The willingness to use force to suppress demonstrations is very clear. But people are turning out in the streets. That the international and notably the Ukrainian effort to get information into Russia via social media and others is pretty impressive. And the context is much of the public doesn't trust the official media in Russia before the war. And as troops come home in body bags, as families begin to retell stories of what they've heard about bombing civilians, at what point others in the elite determined that Putin's got to go because the price to Russia, and not coincidentally, price to themselves, their own fortunes and prospects, is too high. That the Russian people, unfortunately, they will once again suffer for something for which they are not at all responsible in this. And the kind of sanctions that are imposed, credit cards, American Express, Visa, MasterCard, travel by Russians to go buy stuff, and all of that, it's over. So it'll affect ordinary people, and some of that can be turned around right away. But the halting of investment, the location of prospective investment that might have gone to Russia someplace else, it'll go someplace else, and there won't be another round of investment until it's time for a new technology or expansion or something. China really is a one commodity economy.
Russia.
Russia. I'm sorry, the Russia is, and it's hydrocarbons. They sell metals and minerals and timber to China, but it's mostly the hydrocarbons, and John McCain's quip that Russia is a gas station with nuclear weapons does have a certain amount of reality to it. But the disruptions to the energy sector by the curtailment of projects, by the curtailments of technology, by the effects of climate change. I mean, one of the things that hasn't been mentioned, climate change, melting permafrost, puts at risk an enormous segment of the Russian energy industry. It's built on the assumption that permafrost stays permanently frozen. It's not staying permanently frozen anymore. And nobody has a clue yet what the technology is that's necessary to bolster these production and pipeline facilities. And now they're cut off from the world's leaders in hydrocarbon extraction. So it's going to hurt.
Okay. Thank you. Marcia, I see your hand, but Bud's question is first. So Bud's question, first a comment, then a question. Our government is apparently talking to Poland about supplying MiG jets to Ukraine. How is Putin likely to react?
Unhappily, that the I was surprised that the MiGs had not already been transferred. Now, when I heard that this was in consideration, because Ukrainians know how to fly them, they have them in their own inventory. So all you need to do is get some pilots to Poland and other parts of the former Soviet Union now in NATO and let them fly them back. What I learned yesterday is a hang up on this is we've already retrofitted a number of these things to put in advanced guidance and control systems that the Ukrainians don't know how to fly. So I guess we're going to have to rip some stuff out, put the old stuff back in before it can be transferred. That will make a difference. That if they can, from the air, engage these stalled convoys, you take out the first couple. A lot of these look like the highway of death from Kuwait to Iraq, where you bomb the first one and nobody can get past. And the Soviets have got air cover, but if there are more airplanes coming at them, only one has to get through.
Okay, thank you. Marcia.
What's your reaction to Lindsey Graham's suggestion that someone in Russia should take out Putin?
I think it's as dumb as a lot of other things Lindsey Graham has said over the last 4 years. And I once actually had some respect for him. As a former military lawyer, he said sensible things. He says lots of nonsensical things. And at a minimum, if somebody makes an attempt on Putin's life, much of the world will now believe that was at the instigation of the United States, and they'll point to that statement as proof that that's the case. If somebody goes after Putin, I think they'll have plenty of reasons besides a statement from the senator from South Carolina. Is that where he's from?
All right, Tom. So we have 3 more here. The first one, how do we justify the coalition that went into Kuwait to push out Saddam Hussein when he invaded, and not use similar rationale to not invade in Russia, but just push the military forces back to their own borders?
That the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1990 got UN Security Council approval for military action. That this is in the twilight of the Soviet Union. This is Gorbachev trying to transform the country and fundamentally change the relationship with the West. So didn't veto this. That nobody had any particular affection for Saddam Hussein. And this was pretty blatant going into Kuwait. So the UN approval was key to marshaling the international coalition to respond to it. It was an alliance of a coalition of the willing, but with UN sanction, very different than the 2003 US attack on Iraq, which did not have UN sanction, including the French and the Germans were among those who voted against it in the Security Council.
So a similar question here, but with a different lineup of countries. How do we justify NATO's bombing Serbia during the conflict in Bosnia to push back Serbian troops? Were all of the parties involved NATO countries? And as a side, the comment is, a nephew actually flew American jets in that conflict with Serbia. What was the rationale, and in what ways is it similar or different from what we face in Ukraine?
Yeah, it is a contentious use of NATO resources. This was the military action, if my memory is right here, were not in the name of NATO. They were NATO members like the United States. NATO was involved in other parts of peacekeeping, in combating ethnic cleansing that had failed. That it comes pretty close, in my judgment, to we decided we needed to do this. The United States and mostly the US and the UK decided it was necessary to stop the ethnic cleansing and outrageous actions of Slobodan Milosevic and his generals, and acted without additional sanction other than appeals to such things as international humanitarian law. And I do have a problem with bombing to save lives. It doesn't register with me, but it was not sanctioned.
Okay, thank you for that key difference. And lastly, you have referred to this earlier, but how can Ukraine prevail if it cannot control its own skies?
With great difficulty. I've been surprised by things we haven't seen, and there must be a reason, but I don't know what it is. For example, there are all kinds of drones available, commercially available, from glorified toys to stuff used in surveillance. And you wouldn't have to be much of an engineer to strap explosives on it and have a swarm of drones go down into a troop formation or a convoy. And to my knowledge, that hasn't happened. There have been larger drones, which I assume are airplanes with no pilot. So think of it as a suicide airplane with no pilot that goes crashing into things. But the Russians can, with using their air support, they can destroy a lot of stuff, and they can get in and occupy the cities. But Ukraine has 44 million people, and probably you can count on one hand the number that are likely sympathizers with the occupation. That you've got a history of organization to resist that has been very active since 2014. So it's not dim memories of what they did in World War II. These are recent memory and recent organization and recent training for urban resistance. It's a pretty urbanized country. So it can be made unpleasant for the Russians in the way that the Iraqis made it very unpleasant for the United States. Despite our vastly superior firepower and complete control of the airs. Fortunately, there's not a tradition of suicide bombing, but there certainly is a tradition of sabotage and small bands of people going in and causing havoc. And so that's what I think will make this long-term not viable for the Russians. And the military talking heads that I've heard, I know most of them, that emphasize they have too few people. There are too few Russian soldiers for the task of occupying, maintaining order, even supplying themselves if they capture these major cities. An example that I like is think of the Russian army as the German Shepherd chasing the car, and it catches it. And what does it do now that it's got the bumper in its mouth? There almost certainly is not a viable plan B for winning hearts and minds, for stabilizing the country, for presenting, again, the Russians spent 10 years trying to pacify Afghanistan, a much, much less developed country with much less access to international support. And the comparison between being able to send stuff in by train coming across the border in Europe, and we supplied the resistance in Afghanistan with mules, caravans of mules going through the passes from Pakistan, smuggling routes. That's what we had to do. That's not what needs to be done to support the Ukrainians.
Okay, thank you. Follow up from Bud relative to the question about MiGs to Poland and so on. Might Putin respond with nuclear weapons because of that?
I don't think so. I mean, Putin has spoken out strongly against proposals to declare a no-fly zone over Ukraine. That every comment I've seen has, by American and other NATO officials, rejecting calls to declare a no-fly zone because there's no way to enforce it that doesn't put NATO into the conflict. So that's a perceived red line that NATO doesn't appear willing to cross. And I'm sure one of the reasons they're not willing to cross it is a concern about pushing Putin too far into a corner where he acts in extremis and may try to authorize use of nuclear weapons. And there is a piece of Russian doctrine that is unclear and controversial, what it means. And the Russians have obscured it when asked to clarify it, for limited use of nuclear weapons in order to end a conventional conflict. Not as the bottom of an escalatory ladder, but basically to get attention and to stop the conventional. Now, exactly what that means is left to the imagination deliberately of the people asking the question or worried about what it might mean.
Okay. A comment and then a question here. I am uneasy about characterizing NATO as the defender of democracy rather than the principle of territorial integrity. There is a danger, I think, that any non-democracy ought to becomes automatically our enemy. Is that what we want?
I share the concern. And of course, that's not what we want. That in describing what I did is this transformation of NATO from one kind of an entity to another kind of entity. That's a process. And how far it has gone, how far it will go, it's watch this space on it. But what I think is clear is that something that was inconceivable is no longer inconceivable. And it may be happening, or it may be being broached and debated. But at least as I interpret what the administration is saying about democracy and democracies, it's not democracy promotion, which was the slogan of the Bush administration, Bush 43 administration, on the guise that the democracies everywhere made us more secure, made everybody else more secure, and implied that we ought to play an active role in changing the internal affairs, structures, governance of places. That seems to be ruled out by what I've read about the Biden administration, democracy summit, democracy promotion, which seems much more about providing assistance to democracies that are under siege in some way. Disruptive social media, that interference via cyber manipulation of elections or information, shared best practices, best experiences, or worst experiences in coping with intense populism or sharp partisan divide. But the extension is, if there is an attack by an authoritarian regime, or presumably by anybody, but we've got this probably fanciful notions that democracies don't attack one another, which I think is worrisome, if not completely fantasy. But that any attack on a democracy, almost by definition, is going to be by an authoritarian regime of some type. And it's the aggression that's sort of at the margins. If you're making the decision of, do you come to the aid of the besieged party or not, that the tiebreaker or the tipping criteria is, it is or it isn't a democracy. That's my interpretation of what the administration has said. I may be wrong, but I think that's where they're trying to go.
Okay. Let's see, we have some overlap and duplicates again, some more about trying to make an analogy between the slaughter and potential slaughter of Ukrainian citizens as opposed to what happened in Serbia. Any commentary on that?
The difference, I'm not sure, I don't think I want to make it a justification, is that the Serbian regime had carried out what the tribunal in The Hague subsequently determined to be crimes against humanity, crimes of war, genocide, under the name of ethnic cleansing. This was a regime that had done bad things. Putin has episodically over the last 10 days attempted to depict the regime in Kyiv as a Nazi regime, as a genocidal regime that has attacked the Russian speakers in the country, that has attacked Russia. None of those things are true. And so it's the difference between the mugger and the person being mugged. That an attack on Russian forces that have invaded Ukraine under contrived rationales is just different than attacking a regime that has carried out untoward actions against citizens of their own country or citizens of a former part of their own country that had declared a separate existence. So it's the humanitarian war crimes dimension of it that I think would be adduced as the difference.
Okay, thank you. I will ask the last question, and that is, you've pointed out tonight, and I think Steve pointed out last week, that the Ukrainian Air Force is still flying.
Mhm.
So, obviously Russia has a huge advantage, an air advantage over the Ukrainians. Why haven't they used it to wipe out the Ukrainian Air Force?
I'm sure they have tried, but as I'm sure fighter pilots would attest, it's not all that easy. It's why we have Top Gun schools and the like. That unless the Russians have been flying in Syria, they don't have a lot of recent combat experience. I'm sure they're shooting down a lot, but they're also losing some number. And I get stuff pushed at me every day. Some of it comes from Ukrainians, some of it comes from Russians. None of it is true or reliable, but there's some pretty big numbers in there in terms of claimed kills of airplanes. Also a number of soldiers killed or civilians. No, these numbers are all wrong, but none of the numbers are zero in this, that there's active aerial combat going on, probably by people that are not as proficient as we expect US Air Force or Navy pilots to be, and have not had anywhere near the kind of training or recent combat experience.
All right, thanks. Tom, do you want to give us a preview of next week?
I do. Thank you for everybody who stayed with us this evening. Next week, the topic is Myanmar and ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And our speaker will be another friend of mine from the State Department. Scott is the most recent US ambassador to Myanmar. And prior to that, one of his assignments was as the US ambassador to the ASEAN, that group of nations. So he's highly knowledgeable and very current. And like Steve Pfeiffer, Scott Mercier is on in high demand for commentary on the coup and the post-coup situation in Myanmar and the disruptive impact that's had on ASEAN. So I urge everybody who can to join us next week for what I'm sure will be an informative presentation.
Very good. So we look forward to that. But again, Tom, want to say on behalf of everyone here online tonight, thank you very, very much for this very enlightening presentation. And obviously by the questions, all of them were relative to what's going on in the Ukraine, and appreciate your very thoughtful and, to my mind anyway, very logical answers. So thank you very much, Tom. We appreciate it. And we look forward to next week.
Thank you, Lou, and good night all.
Good night.
Thanks to the people that are putting up clapping symbols.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording now, and then I'll end the meeting. Okay.